Welcome to Daily Podcast.
Easy English Conversations, English Podcast.
So why is it that you can remember, the exact moment someone ate the last perfectly golden French fry off your plate, from 3 years ago?
Oh, yeah, like it happened yesterday.
Right, but then you can't remember the critical information you studied for a presentation just yesterday morning. I mean, think about that disconnect for a second. Welcome to today's deep dive, where we're going on a bit of a tiny brain vacation. No passport required for this one.
Definitely not.
We spend so much of our lives trying to just, force information into our brains through sheer repetition, staring at manuals, reviewing flashcards, all that.
The brute force method.
Exactly. Yet the memories that actually stick, the ones that become a permanent part of our operating system, they are almost always tied to a bizarre story or a moment of mild embarrassment or even just a sudden burst of laughter.
Yeah, well, it really highlights a pretty fundamental misunderstanding of how the human brain actually, acquires and retains knowledge. We so often treat learning as this purely mechanical process of data input.
Like we're just hard drives.
Right, exactly. But cognitive science shows us that memory is deeply intertwined with emotion and context. When we try to learn something, especially a complex skill like, say, a new language, in a sterile, high-pressure environment, our brains naturally put up defenses.
Because we're stressed out.
Yeah, we become anxious about making mistakes.
Yeah.
And that actually physically impedes our ability to absorb new information.
Well, we are diving into a source today that completely dismantles that traditional sterile approach. It's actually an audio session designed for B1 level English learners.
Which is fascinating in itself.
It is, because if you didn't know the context, you would never, ever guess it was an educational tool. There are no vocabulary drills. There's zero grammar lecturing.
None at all.
Instead, you are essentially eavesdropping on two friends playing this somewhat chaotic game of truth or dare. And our mission today isn't just to learn some vocab. It's to decode how this source brilliantly uses vulnerability, humor, and relatable storytelling to make complex language stick.
Yeah, the underlying pedagogy here is brilliant because it actively manipulates the learning environment to just completely bypass those psychological defenses.
Okay, let's unpack this because it's so refreshing to find material that doesn't feel like a textbook.
What's fascinating here is how the source uses absurd humor and highly calculated vulnerability to create what linguists sometimes call a low effective filter.
A low effective filter. So basically making the learner feel safe.
Spot on. By making the learner feel like they are just hanging out with friends, the brain drops its guard. It allows complex idioms to anchor themselves to vivid emotional experiences rather than, abstract dictionary definitions.
And we are going to decode the mechanics of exactly how they pull this off, because whether you are trying to pick up a new language or maybe master a frustrating piece of software at work or just find better ways to communicate with your team, these techniques, hidden inside this truth or dare game, offer a real blueprint.
A blueprint for making any kind of information unforgettable.
Right. So let's get into it. Before you can teach deep emotional vocabulary, you obviously have to make the learner comfortable, right?
Yeah, the strategy begins before the actual game even starts.
Yep.
And they use a technique that seems, honestly, completely throwaway on the surface.
The weather banter.
Yes. They open with this extended banter about the weather. But they don't do it in that stiff textbook, the sky is blue today kind of way.
No, it's very real. It's grounded in physical discomfort. Like one of the speakers describes walking outside and feeling like a walking onion.
The walking onion. I love that phrase.
Because the weather kept shifting so rapidly between freezing wind and bright sun, so they were forced to constantly put on and take off layers of clothing all morning.
And anyone who has ever lived in a place with unpredictable spring weather knows that exact feeling intimately.
Oh, for sure. And then the other speaker counters with an equally vivid metaphor. They describe themselves as a human ice cube.
Right, because they looked out the window, saw the sun, and just arrogantly walked outside in a t-shirt.
And got immediately ambushed by the cold. It got so bad they ended up buying a hot cup of tea that they didn't even want to drink. They just used it purely as a hand warmer for the rest of the afternoon.
Which is so funny
Yeah.
and relatable. And by establishing this shared reality of minor, universally understood suffering, they're performing a cognitive warm-up.
A warm-up for the brain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When you sit down to learn, your brain is often in a state of high cognitive load or maybe mild performance anxiety. You are bracing yourself to do the work.
Right, you're tense.
Yeah. So the speakers bypass this by leaning into the confusion of a day that just doesn't have a clear mood, what they call a what is this day feeling, it signals to the listener's brain that this is a safe, completely informal space.
And I noticed they don't just leave it as a passive performance either. Right in the middle of this funny back and forth about the onion and the ice cube, they suddenly break the fourth wall.
Yes, this part is so clever.
They ask the listener directly, like, they say, think in English right now. Today the weather is. And they prompt you to silently finish that sentence in your head.
It's brilliant.
To me, it struck me as this sort of Trojan horse for language production. I mean, they get you practicing before you even recognize that the lesson has officially started.
That invisible transition is so key to adult learning. Because when you explicitly tell an adult, okay, now it's time to practice, their self-monitoring systems just kick into overdrive.
Oh, yeah. You start stressing about syntax and pronunciation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But by sliding the prompt into the middle of a joke about holding a cup of tea for warmth, the cognitive friction is almost zero. You just fill in the blank effortlessly because your brain is already fully engaged in the narrative.
So they set this great baseline of comfort. And that is essential because they immediately pivot into territory that usually makes learners incredibly uncomfortable. The truth round.
Right, the game begins.
And this is where they start teaching highly specific idioms about like holding on to negative emotions, and they do it by demanding personal confessions.
Yeah, the first major vocabulary cluster here centers around the concept of resentment. The prompt asks for a truth, and one speaker launches into the story of the VIP French fry.
The VIP French... Okay, we have to unpack this. She confesses to harboring a 3-year grudge against a close friend.
Over a potato.
Yes. The friend reached over and ate the very last perfectly golden, crispy French fry off her plate when she wasn't looking. The betrayal in her voice is completely over the top, but it perfectly illustrates the idiom they're introducing. Hold a grudge.
And she talks about how the friend pulled the classic excuse where, I thought you were finished.
And she just pretends everything is fine, smiling while secretly swearing a lifelong vendetta. She summarizes the whole experience as a bittersweet memory. Because the friendship was sweet, but the loss of that VIP potato remains very, very bitter.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, notice how they are manipulating semantic and episodic memory here.
Break that down for us. What's the difference?
So semantic memory is basically your brain's encyclopedia. It stores abstract facts, dictionary definitions, that sort of thing. But episodic memory is your brain's autobiographical documentary. It stores personal experiences and the emotions attached to them.
Okay, got it.
Traditional learning relies really heavily on semantic memory, which is notoriously difficult to maintain without constant, boring repetition. But this source, it forces the vocabulary straight into the episodic memory network.
Because of the story.
Right. You don't just learn the sterile definition of bittersweet, you attach it to the specific, hilarious image of someone glaring at a stolen French fry.
But let me stop you there and push back on this methodology a little bit. Here's where it gets really interesting to me, because framing educational lesson around vulnerability actually sounds incredibly risky.
How so?
Well, we are talking about casual learners here, right? Not people stepping into a therapist's office. The source is asking the listener to think about their own grudges, to recall times they felt betrayed, just to learn phrases like, spill the beans. If you ask a random group of people to surface their resentments, you aren't always going to get a funny story about a potato. You might invite some genuine emotional baggage. Doesn't that risk spiking a learner's anxiety and completely shutting down that cognitive openness you were just talking about?
It is a significant risk, absolutely. Which is why the curation of the examples is the single most important pedagogical tool at play here.
Ah, okay. The guardrails.
Exactly. The source doesn't just ask an open-ended question about deep trauma. They model the exact altitude of vulnerability they want the listener to match. By using a stolen fry, or, later they mention a broken coffee mug, they establish very firm guardrails.
They are explicitly communicating that we are exploring the realm of low-stakes annoyance, not profound psychological pain, keeping it in the shallow end of the emotional pool.
Yes. And biologically, this matters. In neuroscience, there's a structure in the brain called the amygdala, which processes emotional responses and helps tag memories for long-term storage.
The fight-or-flight center.
Right. If an experience is too traumatic, the amygdala triggers a stress response that impairs the prefrontal cortex, literally blocking complex learning. But, and this is the key, if the emotional arousal is mild, like the relatable annoyance of someone eating your food. The amygdala signals the hippocampus to store the information firmly without triggering that panic response.
Wow. So they are essentially hacking the amygdala using minor embarrassment.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
And that distinction really explains why the second story in the truth round works so well without crossing the line. The taxi driver confession.
Oh, the taxi driver.
Yeah.
The architecture of that story is just a masterclass in situational vocabulary building.
It really is. So to recap for you listening, the speaker describes having an incredibly stressful week. One of those weeks where just everything goes wrong. She gets into a taxi, exhausted, and the driver simply glances in the rearview mirror and asks, "Long day."
Just 2 words.
2 words. And that tiny question completely pushes her buttons. It shatters her composure, and she proceeds to spill her heart out to this complete stranger.
She delivers this basically manic monologue about her complicated family dynamics, her overwhelming workload, and this sudden desperate desire to just move to the coast and live quietly with a cat.
Just a full TED Talk on her own burnout to a captive audience. She's totally vulnerable, and the punchline is the driver's response. After this epic, unprompted emotional dump, the driver just stares at the road and calmly replies, "Traffic is very bad today."
It's hilarious. And we could look at this through the lens of schema theory.
Okay, schema theory.
A schema is a cognitive framework that helps us organize and interpret information. When you teach a phrase like "spill your heart out" in total isolation, the learner has no schema for it, it's just words.
Right.
But nearly every adult has a schema for oversharing with a stranger, a bartender, a seatmate on an airplane, or a taxi driver. By mapping the new idioms directly onto that existing, highly cinematic schema, the source ensures the vocabulary integrates immediately.
It hooks right into the existing neural networks. The image of the poor taxi driver who just wanted to talk about traffic, suddenly burdened with a stranger's dream of owning a seaside cat, it is permanently linked to the phrase "spill your heart out."
Permanently.
But the source doesn't let the listener get too comfortable in the storytelling mode, because halfway through, they abruptly change the rules. They abandon the truth round entirely.
Yes, they declare that the rest of the game is dare only.
Right. So we are moving from emotional vulnerability to active performance vulnerability.
Which is a totally necessary escalation in the learning process. Because passive listening, no matter how engaging the stories are, that only builds receptive language skills.
The listening part.
Exactly. To build productive language skills, the ability to actually speak and formulate sentences, you have to force the learner to generate output under some kind of pressure.
And the first dare is wonderfully bizarre. One of the speakers is dared to deliver a 20-second weather report. But, not of the sky outside. They have to give a live weather report of the inside of their own brain at that exact moment.
This is where we see the application of spatial mapping, which is an incredibly powerful cognitive tool.
Yeah, the speaker breaks their mind down geographically. They say that in the north of their brain, there is a light rain of unfinished ideas just constantly falling.
A light rain.
And in the middle, hovering right over everything, is this massive, slow-moving cloud of guilt about needing to go to the gym but not wanting to. Over in the east, there is a strong, annoying wind of phone notifications buzzing. And then down in the south, it's clear skies, bright sun, and happy anticipation for midnight snacks and a movie.
It's such a great visual. And the reason that exercise feels so compelling is because it engages the hippocampus, the part of the brain that evolved primarily to handle spatial navigation.
Like helping our ancestors remember where the river was.
Or where a predator lived. Exactly. When you force the brain to assign physical locations to abstract internal feelings, you're basically piggybacking on millions of years of evolutionary biology. Tying abstract concepts to physical space makes them significantly easier to manipulate and, crucially, to remember.
But, watching this dare play out brings up a serious question about their methods. So what does this all mean for the learner's stress levels? Because before the speaker gives that brain weather report, they hesitate.
They do.
They explicitly use the idiom chicken out, admitting they are scared to do it because they might freeze up and sound foolish. We look at the reality of being put on the spot. Doesn't this deliberate pressure risk backfiring?
It's a fair question.
I mean, we have all seen someone completely shut down when asked to perform a complex task in front of others. This feels dangerously close to exposure therapy for language learners.
Well, it functions very similarly to exposure therapy, actually, and your concern about the risk is totally valid. When you are put on the spot, your sympathetic nervous system activates. This is the biological stress response.
The cortisol flood.
Yes, cortisol floods your system, your heart rate increases, your brain prepares for fight or flight. In a traditional classroom, if a teacher calls on you and you stumble, the silence and the perceived judgment amplify that cortisol spike. And that literally paralyzes the language centers of the brain. You just go blank.
Right. So how does this source avoid triggering that paralysis? Because they push the speaker even further with the next stare. They pull out the classic tongue twister, "She sells seashells by the seashore."
A nightmare for learners.
And they make the speaker say it 3 times, faster and faster, essentially guaranteeing a failure.
But here's the genius of it. They mitigate that cortisol spike through the deliberate application of shared humor, which introduces endorphins and dopamine into the equation.
Balancing the chemicals.
Exactly. When the speaker attempts the tongue twister, their mouth completely revolves. They describe it as their tongue going on holiday. They stumble, they mix up the S and she sounds, turning it into she shells, and it just devolves into a total disaster. But crucially, the other host doesn't correct them.
No, instead, they both completely crack up, which is another idiom they introduce right there. They laugh uncontrollably at the mistakes.
And by laughing at the stumble, they reframe the biological stress response. The elevated heart rate is no longer a threat response. It becomes a challenge response.
They are modeling for the listener that failure in language production isn't some huge social danger. It is just a mechanical inevitability.
Yes. By celebrating the fact that the tongue went on holiday, they normalize the friction of learning. A brain flooded with the endorphins of laughter is highly neuroplastic and incredibly receptive to storing new pathways.
It is the exact opposite of getting the red pen on a spelling test. The failure actually becomes the most enjoyable part of the lesson.
Exactly.
And this normalization of messy, imperfect learning perfectly sets up the final phase of their deep dive. After the wild ride of VIP potatoes, taxi drivers, and seashell disasters, they bring everything together into this highly structured synthesis they call the word tour.
The word tour. This is where we see a fascinating inversion of traditional educational structures. They transition from all that experiential, chaotic play into explicit, structured definitions.
Right. They lay out all the idioms they've just naturally used in the game. Spill the beans, put someone on the spot, chicken out, crack up, spill your heart out, freak out, push someone's buttons, vulnerable, hold a grudge, and bittersweet.
A lot of vocabulary.
A ton. They walk through each one, giving clear, concise definitions. But the genius of this section isn't the list itself. It's the instruction they give the listener right afterward. Knowing how easily we get overwhelmed by information overload, knowing you, the listener, probably hate that, they explicitly tell you, do not try to memorize this entire list.
Which is such a relief to hear. That instruction is vital for long-term retention.
They say just pick 1 or 2 phrases that resonated with you, take those into your heart today, and give yourself absolute permission to forget the rest. I mean, it feels like the ultimate hack for sustainable learning. We are so conditioned to try and memorize the entire chapter, and when we inevitably forget half of it by Tuesday, we feel like we failed.
Relieving that cognitive burden is crucial. When you tell a learner they only need to remember one thing, they relax. And ironically, that relaxation often allows them to retain much more than they actually intended.
So true.
But this raises an important question. Looking closely at this word tour, the most radical pedagogical choice is simply where they placed it. In a standard language textbook, the definitions come first, right?
Oh. Chapter 1 begins with the glossary. Here's the definition of a grudge. Here's the definition of spilling the beans.
Exactly. And then Chapter 2 features this stilted artificial dialogue forcing those words into a conversation.
It always sounds like aliens trying to mimic human speech. Greetings, friend. Are you currently holding a grudge about the precipitation today?
Totally devoid of natural rhythm or emotion. But this source flips that model entirely on its head. The definitions are placed at the very end of the experience. And the reason this works so effectively ties into a concept called usage-based linguistics.
Usage-based linguistics.
By the time the listener reaches the formal definition of holding a grudge, they aren't trying to attach a meaning to an empty sequence of letters. They already possess this rich, hilarious, emotionally resonant mental image of a friend chewing a stolen French fry.
I see. The context precedes the definition.
Always. That is how human beings naturally acquire their first language. We do not learn our mother tongue by reading a dictionary.
No, we definitely don't.
We learn it by navigating the world, making messy mistakes, experiencing sharp emotions, and only later attaching specific vocabulary to those lived experiences. We learn what a grudge is because a sibling broke our favorite toy, or because a not because a teacher handed us a flashcard.
Right, so the formal definition at the end isn't the primary learning tool at all. It's just the final crystallization of a concept the listener has already felt and understood through the stories. It is just a completely organic way to absorb complex information.
The architecture of this session really proves that if you try to acquire complex skills through sheer force of rote memorization, you are fighting your own neurology. But if you can anchor new knowledge to personal narratives, humor, a sense of play, and a tolerable level of vulnerability, your brain will encode that information almost effortlessly.
It really is a profound shift in how we approach self-improvement. Humor and vulnerability aren't just entertaining icebreakers for a podcast or meeting. They are fundamental mechanisms for retention. A simple game of truth or dare, when engineered correctly, creates the absolute perfect ecosystem for learning. Because the bitter loss of a VIP potato is, well, it's simply unforgettable.
It really is. And the practical application for you listening right now extends far beyond language learning. Think about the last time you tried to explain a difficult concept during a meeting, or maybe struggled to learn a new process at work. If you are just delivering or receiving dry facts, the effective filter remains high and the retention remains incredibly low.
People just tune out.
Exactly. The challenge is to find the walking onion or the stolen French fry in whatever subject you are tackling. Finding the human, slightly absurd anchor for your data is what makes it stick.
I love that. Find your walking onion. So as we wrap up this tiny brain vacation, I want to leave you with a final thought to explore on your own, inspired by that brilliant dare round.
Oh, the brain weather?
Yes. Take a moment right now and visualize your own 20-second brain weather report. If you had to map out your mind geographically at this exact second, what would the forecast look like?
I'm picturing mine right now.
Right. Is there a heavy fog of unread emails hovering in the north? A sudden thunderstorm of anxiety about dinner plans in the east? Or maybe a light, pleasant breeze of curiosity rolling through the center? Try to attach a physical landscape to whatever abstract feeling you are holding right now. It's a great exercise.
And more importantly, consider how you could use that kind of creative spatial metaphor to explain a complex emotion to someone else today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. See you next time.